but we can also be much. Hi, I'm John, and in this IT Taster video I'm going to cover file and folder permissions, and I'm going to show you how to configure them using Windows Server 2012 R2. File and folder permissions enable us to implement what are known as access controls. Access controls determine the level of access our users have to an object, in this case file and folder objects. We can control the files and folders our users are able to access, but we can also be much more granular and control what our users are able to do with those files and folders. For example, a manufacturing company might allow the technical department to create and modify technical data, but only allow the production department to view or read technical data. And this is the sort of thing we can do with file and folder permissions. File and folder permissions are sometimes referred to as NTFS permissions. Let's begin with the NTFS part. Microsoft's network operating system prior to Windows 2000 was Windows NT. NT stands for New Technology, and Windows NT is where we first saw the New Technology file system, NTFS. NTFS isn't a new technology anymore, but it's stood the test of time and remains widely in use today. It has a number of important features, including the one we're interested in, being able to set file and folder permissions. It's important to note, in order to implement file and folder permissions, we must have an NTFS volume or an REFS resilient file system volume. That is, a partition formatted as NTFS or REFS. When working with file and folder permissions, there are some important rules to be aware of, and I'll cover those along the way. Permissions are applied to objects, so I'm going to begin by creating a new folder object, and I'm going to call it Technical. To manage file and folder permissions, we need to right-click the file or folder object, click Properties, and click the Security tab. We can see the name of the object we're working with, the technical folder in this case, and we can see the users and groups. And we can also see the permissions assigned to them, which determine the level of access they have to the technical folder. If we click the IT Taster Administrators group, we can see we have write permission, read permission, list folder contents, pretty much everything assigned. But don't worry too much about the actual permissions for now, we'll cover those shortly. The permissions we can see here are known as standard permissions. Standard permissions are a combination of single permissions. They're easy to configure and normally sufficient for most situations. But where more complex access controls are needed, we also have the option to set advanced permissions, also referred to as special permissions. If I click the Advanced button and double-click the Administrators group, we can see the standard permissions currently assigned to the Administrators group. But if I click Show Advanced Permissions, we have many more options which enable us to set more precise granular permissions. The permissions are fairly self-explanatory, but it's extremely important to have a clear understanding of exactly what each permission does to avoid misconfiguration and undesired results. And remember, permissions can be applied to files as well as folders, and the permissions have different meaning depending on whether they're applied to a file or folder. A detailed description of each file and folder permission can be found by searching Microsoft's website. I'm going to cover some of the most common permissions in this video, but I'm going to stick with using standard permissions. Okay, let's take a look at how to configure standard permissions. To do this, we need to click Edit, click Add. I'm going to add the Tech Managers group. It's a good idea to check the group name and click OK. And we're now able to set permissions for the Tech Managers group. Now I'm going to clear the permissions that have been automatically added so that we can go through each permission, starting with the most restrictive. List folder contents is only applied to folders. It's very restrictive. It only allows the user or group assigned this permission to see file names and the names of any subfolders. Read permission allows a user or group to read files, view file permissions and file attributes. That means reading the contents of a file, opening the file as read only. Read permission, when applied to folders, allows the user to view the files and folders within a folder and view the folder's permissions. Write permission, when applied to a file, allows a user or group to overwrite the file, change the file's attributes, and also view the file's permissions. When write permission is applied to a folder, the user or group can create files within the folder and also create subfolders. Users are also able to change folder attributes and view folder ownership and permissions. The next permission is read and execute. I'm going to remove the read permission I previously set, and notice when I tick read and execute, read is automatically ticked again, and this is because read and execute is a combination of the read permission we've just covered and execute permission. We have read permissions exactly as before, but we're able to execute files, launch files by clicking on them, and navigate through subfolders. Next is the modify permission. I'm going to clear the permissions I've previously set and click the modify permission. And as you can see, modify combines a number of permissions. Modify gives us write permission, read and execute permission, but we are now able to change files, modify them, and delete files. When modify permissions are applied to a folder, the user or group can delete folders and create files within the folder, and they can also create subfolders. And finally, we're left with full control. I'm going to clear all of the permissions that we've previously set, and if we click full control, as you'd expect, full control combines all of the previous permissions we've covered so far, and also two very important permissions. Full control enables the user or group to change permissions and take ownership of files and folders. This is something that administrators are able to do. Users or groups assigned this permission are able to set access controls on the files or folders this permission is applied to. This is often overlooked when setting permissions. Do we really want our users or groups to be able to do this? If the answer is no, modify is a much better option. So I'm going to assign the Tech Manager's modify permission to the technical folder. Click apply and click OK. Now there are some important things to be aware of in terms of how permissions are applied. Permissions can be assigned to users and groups, and different permissions can be assigned to those users and groups. In this example, we have a user called Bill. Bill has been assigned list folder contents permission to the technical folder. Bill is a member of the tech support group, which is assigned read and execute permission to the technical folder. And Bill is also a member of the Tech Managers group, which is assigned modify permission to the technical folder. So how do we determine what effective permission Bill has to the technical folder? Well, NTFS permissions are cumulative. We simply need to add up the permissions assigned to the user and groups the user belongs to. We have list folder contents plus read and execute plus modify permission to the technical folder. Modify permission includes list folder contents and read and execute permission. So if we add them together, Bill's effective permission to the technical folder is modify. We're also able to view a user's effective permissions to an object. If we go back to the technical folder and set some permissions, I'm going to add our user Bill, and I'm going to assign him list folder contents. I'm also going to add the tech support group, and I'm going to leave the tech support group with read and execute permission. So we pretty much have the same setup as the example we looked at in the presentation. To view a user's effective permissions, we need to right-click the object, click Properties, click the Security tab, click the Advanced button, and click Effective Access. We need to select the user, in this case Bill, and we need to add the groups we're interested in. I'm going to add the tech support group, and I'm also going to add the tech managers group. And we need to click View Effective Access. And if we scroll down, we can see Bill's effective permissions, which are a combination of Bill the user and his group memberships. We've seen that when a user has more than one file and folder permission applied to them, their effective permissions are cumulative. However, there's an important exception to this rule, and this is the deny permission. A deny permission overrides an allow permission. And in this example, we have our user Bill again. And just as before, we can see the permissions Bill has been assigned to the technical folder. We know that allow permissions are cumulative, and Bill's effective permission is modify. But if we were to assign deny modify permission to the tech managers group, members of the tech managers group, which includes our user Bill, are now denied modify permission to the technical folder. Therefore, Bill is denied modify permission to the technical folder. But Bill is a member of the tech support group, which has read and execute permissions. And Bill himself is assigned list folder contents permission to the technical folder. So what is Bill's effective permissions to the technical folder? Well, we know the modify permission is a combination of other permissions, which includes list folder contents and read and execute. But because a deny permission overrides an allow permission, Bill is denied list folder contents and read and execute permission. And that's the rule to remember. If we deny a permission, the user is denied the permission regardless of any other group memberships. Deny permission overrides an allow permission. To deny a permission, all we need to do is select the user or group. I'm going to select the tech managers group. And as per the example, I'm going to assign the deny modify permission. Click OK. And we receive a warning that tells us deny permissions override allow permissions, and do we want to continue. I'm going to click yes to proceed and click OK. Let's now take a look at Bill's effective permissions to access the technical folder. We need to add Bill. And add the groups, tech support, and the tech managers group, click view effective access, and if we scroll down, we can see that Bill has been denied modify permission, which is pretty much everything. But do bear in mind, Only assign deny permissions if absolutely necessary. Being able to determine the effective permissions of a user or group is really useful. But we also need to understand how permissions are applied to folders, subfolders and files. And for this we need to take a look at inheritance. I'm going to create a new folder within the technical folder, and I'm going to call it support. And I'm going to go into the support folder and create a new text file and call it how to. Let's go back to the support folder and click properties and the security tab, and we can see the various groups and the permissions assigned to them. Now, I didn't add these groups or configure these permissions. I simply created a new folder within the technical folder. When you create an object within another object, the parent object's permissions are assigned to the child object. They are inherited. The users and groups we can see here, and the permissions assigned to our support folder object are inherited permissions, inherited from the parent folder, the technical folder. Inherited permissions appear as greyed out. Inheritance is a very useful feature that can save administrators a lot of time. If I navigate back up to the technical folder and edit its permissions, I'm going to add a new user called Steve. And I'm going to assign Steve modify permission. If we go to our support folder and view its permissions, we can see that the support folder has inherited the new permission we assigned to the technical folder. Steve has modified permission. And if we go to our how-to file and view its permissions, again we can see the how-to file has inherited the newly assigned permission from the parent folder. Now, there will be situations where we don't want the file or folder object to inherit its permissions from the parent object. To disable inheritance, we need to right-click on the file or folder object, click Properties, click the Security tab, click the Advanced button, and click Disable Inheritance. When we do this, we're given two choices. We can convert inherited permissions into explicit permissions. This keeps the previously inherited permissions as a sort of starting point, but we can now add or remove permissions in the normal way. But any changes made to the parent folder from now on no longer propagate down to this folder or its objects. The second option, remove all inherited permissions from this object, removes the inherited permissions and enables us to start from scratch. I'm going to remove all inherited permissions from this object, and all previous permissions have disappeared. No groups or users have permission to access this object, but the owner can still assign permissions. By default, the user who creates a new object, a new file or folder, becomes the owner of that object. The important thing to be aware of is that the owner of an object can change its permissions. Let's add some groups and permissions again. Let's add the administrator, and assign full control. Let's add creator owner and assign full control, and add system. I'm also going to add the tech support group. And we'll leave them with read and execute permissions. To determine the owner of an object, we simply need to click the Advanced button. And we can see the name of our object, the support folder, and its owner, the IT Taster Administrators Group. And we also have the option to change the owner by clicking Change. But I'm going to leave the IT Taster Administrators Group as the owner. Let's quickly run through a few tips and some guidelines to keep in mind when working with file and folder permissions. Assign users the permissions they actually need. If users only need to read and execute files, then assign read and execute permission. Assign permissions to groups rather than users. This makes management much easier. A user can simply be added to the appropriate group and be assigned the permissions they need. There's also less margin for error. Only assign full control permission if absolutely necessary. In most cases, modify permission will do the job. Remember, full control enables users to set permissions and take ownership of objects. Try to avoid using deny permission. Only use it when you need to specifically deny a user or group access to an object. Create a separate partition or volume for your file and folder objects, and leave the system partition well alone. Changing file and folder permissions of system objects is a recipe for disaster. Take the time to plan your file and folder permissions and document it. This will make management and support much easier. And test your permission settings. Create a test account, assign it to the appropriate groups, and check what you can and cannot access. And remember, you can check a user's or group's effective permissions to determine the level of access to an object. Now, one important thing to be aware of, in order to make our file and folder objects available to our network users, they need to be shared. And this is done using shares and share permissions. Share permissions work in conjunction with file and folder permissions, and I'll cover those in another video. Well, I hope this video has been helpful and given you a better understanding of file and folder permissions. Please subscribe to the IT Taster channel if you haven't already. Your comments are welcome, and thanks very much for watching.